There are moments in life when everything around you says, "It is finished." The situation looks closed. The door seems sealed. Logic has spoken, fear has agreed, and even hope appears to whisper, "Be realistic." But it is exactly in moments like this that faith is born, not loud faith, not dramatic faith, but quiet, stubborn faith that refuses to bow to circumstances. You see, faith does not ask permission from the situation. Faith does not wait until conditions improve. Faith moves first. And when faith moves first, something extraordinary happens in the unseen realm. Heaven pauses. Darkness is startled, and God Himself delights. There are times when the enemy expects you to quit. He expects you to surrender to statistics, to history, to past failures. He assumes you will think like everyone else thinks, react like everyone else reacts, and retreat like everyone else retreats. But what he does not expect, what he never anticipates, is a believer who dares to trust God when there is no visible reason to do so. When you take one step of faith in the middle of uncertainty, it may look foolish to the world. People may smile politely and say, "Be careful." Others may say, "You tried before, why try again?" But heaven does not laugh in mockery. Heaven laughs with joy. God rejoices when His children choose trust over fear. Faith is not denying reality. Faith is declaring that God's reality is greater. Faith says, "Yes, I see the problem, but I also see my God." Faith says, "This mountain is real, but it is not permanent." And when you speak like that, when you live like that, something shifts. There are victories that come from strength, and there are victories that come from strategy, but the greatest victories come from obedience. Simple obedience, quiet obedience. Obedience that says, "Lord, I don't understand everything, but I will still follow you." And when you obey like that, you may not hear applause from people, but heaven responds. God finds pleasure not in your perfection, but in your trust, not in your ability, but in your availability, not in your size, but in your surrender. Sometimes you don't need a new plan. Sometimes you need renewed faith. Sometimes you don't need more resources. You need more confidence in the God who supplies. Because when God sees a heart that refuses to give up, that refuses to compromise faith, that refuses to let fear have the final word, He smiles. There are moments when God looks at your decision, your choice to believe, your choice to stand, your choice to move forward, and He laughs with joy, not because the battle is easy, but because He knows the outcome. He knows that what the enemy meant for defeat will become a testimony. He knows that what looked impossible will soon become evidence of His faithfulness. So today, before anything else is said, before any lesson is taught, remember this: your faith has power beyond what you can see. Your obedience matters more than you think. And when you choose to trust God against all expectations, you are not alone. Heaven is watching, and God Himself is rejoicing. Faith that moves before evidence is not a denial of reality. It is a declaration that reality is not the highest authority. It is the decision to act, speak, and believe based on trust rather than sight, on conviction rather than confirmation. Most people wait for signs before they move. They wait for assurance before they commit. They wait for visible progress before they risk obedience. But faith, in its purest form, does not operate on the permission of circumstances. It moves first, not because the path is clear, but because the heart is convinced. When faith moves before evidence, it challenges the natural order of human thinking. Human logic says, "See first, then believe." Faith says, "Believe first, then you will see." This reversal is uncomfortable because it removes control from the hands of human reasoning and places it into trust. It demands courage because it exposes a person to misunderstanding, criticism, and the fear of failure. Yet it is precisely this kind of faith that creates breakthroughs, because it engages a dimension beyond human limitation. Evidence speaks to the senses. Faith speaks to the spirit. Evidence measures what is, faith declares what can be. When a person waits for evidence, they are limited to what is already visible, already proven, already accepted. When a person moves by faith, they step into possibility. They give space for transformation. They open the door for outcomes that logic alone would never predict. Faith before evidence is not reckless optimism. It is disciplined trust anchored in a conviction that there is more at work than what the eyes can perceive. Many moments of destiny are lost, not because people lacked ability, but because they waited too long for proof. Opportunities often appear disguised as uncertainty. Callings often arrive wrapped in fear. Breakthroughs frequently stand behind doors labeled risk. Faith that moves before evidence recognizes that waiting for perfect conditions often means missing the moment entirely. There is a narrow window in which obedience must act, and faith senses that timing even when the mind hesitates. This kind of faith requires inner alignment. The heart must be settled even when the environment is unstable. The mind must be trained to resist panic when outcomes are unclear. Faith before evidence is not emotional impulse. It is a deep, steady confidence that holds its position despite external pressure. It is choosing to move forward while the ground still feels uncertain underfoot, trusting that stability will meet obedience in motion. When faith moves first, it disrupts fear. Fear thrives on delays. Fear grows stronger the longer a person waits, analyzes, and imagines negative outcomes. Faith interrupts that cycle by acting. Action weakens fear because it shifts focus from hypothetical danger to purposeful movement. Even a small step of faith has disproportionate power because it breaks paralysis and creates momentum. Momentum itself becomes evidence, but only after faith has already moved. There is also humility in faith that moves before evidence. It acknowledges that human understanding is limited. It admits that not everything can be calculated, predicted, or controlled. This humility is not weakness, it is wisdom. It frees a person from the burden of needing to understand everything before obeying. It allows learning to happen along the way rather than demanding clarity in advance. Growth, in this sense, is not the reward of certainty, but the result of trust. Faith before evidence often looks foolish to observers. It does not fit neatly into conventional frameworks of success. It resists common metrics of readiness and preparedness. But history consistently shows that transformative moments are rarely preceded by universal agreement. They are initiated by individuals willing to act while others hesitate. Faith does not wait for consensus. It responds to conviction. It moves because it must, not because it is applauded internally. This kind of faith produces resilience. When a person moves only after evidence appears, their confidence is tied to external validation. When faith moves first, confidence becomes internal. It is no longer dependent on immediate results. This allows perseverance when progress is slow and outcomes are delayed. Faith that moves before evidence is not easily discouraged because its motivation is deeper than short-term success. There is also an element of joy in this faith. It is the quiet joy of alignment, the peace that comes from knowing one has acted according to conviction rather than fear. Even when results are not immediate, there is satisfaction in obedience itself. This joy is not loud or dramatic, but it is sustaining. It carries a person through uncertainty without eroding their inner stability. Faith that moves before evidence reshapes identity. A person who consistently acts this way begins to see themselves differently. They no longer define themselves by circumstances, but by calling. They no longer measure their worth by outcomes, but by faithfulness. Over time, this creates a strong internal compass. Decisions are no longer driven by anxiety or comparison, but by purpose. This is how leadership is formed, not by position, but by posture. Such faith also creates room for the unexpected. When evidence dictates movement, outcomes tend to follow predictable patterns. When faith leads, space opens for surprise. Solutions emerge that were not anticipated. Support arrives from unlikely places. Strength appears at moments when it was not felt beforehand. Faith does not manufacture these outcomes. It simply creates the conditions in which they can occur. Ultimately, faith that moves before evidence is an act of surrender. It releases the demand for guarantees. It lets go of the need to control timing and outcomes. It chooses trust over certainty and obedience over comfort. This surrender is not passive. It is active alignment with a reality beyond immediate perception. It is stepping forward not because the way is visible, but because the direction is clear, and that single choice to move becomes the turning point, where limitation gives way to possibility, where hesitation yields to courage, and where belief begins to shape reality long before proof ever arrives and continues unfolding beyond what the mind could calculate or contain. Heaven's joy in unexpected obedience is rooted in the mystery of a heart that responds before it is compelled, before it is rewarded, before it is understood. Obedience that is expected carries weight, but obedience that is unexpected carries delight. It is the kind of response that rises not from pressure or fear, but from trust. When obedience appears where hesitation was anticipated, when surrender emerges where resistance was logical, something deeper than compliance is revealed. It shows a relationship, not a transaction. It reveals a heart that listens not just with ears, but with alignment. Unexpected obedience often occurs in moments when doing nothing would have been easier. It shows up when silence would have been safer, when delay would have been justified, when retreat would have been applauded by reason. In those moments, obedience is not driven by clarity of outcome, but by clarity of conviction. It is not forced by consequence, but offered freely. That freedom is what makes it beautiful. It carries no negotiation, no conditions, no demand for reassurance. It simply responds. There is joy in heaven because unexpected obedience reflects trust at its purest level. Trust that does not need guarantees. Trust that does not require visible benefit. Trust that does not ask, "What will I gain?" but instead says, "I will follow." This kind of obedience cannot be manufactured. It cannot be taught as a technique. It emerges from a heart that has learned to recognize a voice and values, that voice above every competing sound. Unexpected obedience often contradicts personal comfort. It moves against preference. It interrupts plans. It disrupts routines. That is why it surprises not only observers, but even the person who obeys. There are moments when someone looks back at their own response and wonders how they found the courage to act so decisively. That courage does not come from confidence in self, but from surrender of self. It is the courage that comes when trust outweighs fear. Heaven rejoices because unexpected obedience reveals authenticity. It strips away performance. It exposes intention. There is no audience to impress, no reward to secure, no image to protect. The obedience stands alone, sincere and unadorned. It is offered not because it is seen, but because it is right. That sincerity carries immense value. It reflects a heart that is not divided, not calculating, not pretending. Unexpected obedience also carries creative power. It opens doors that planning alone could never unlock. When someone obeys without fully understanding the outcome, space is created for outcomes beyond understanding. Possibilities emerge that were never anticipated. Pathways unfold that could not have been mapped in advance. Obedience becomes a catalyst, not because it controls the future, but because it releases it. There is joy because unexpected obedience often marks a turning point. It becomes the hinge on which direction changes. Many lives shift course not through dramatic events, but through quiet decisions made in moments of internal clarity. These moments are rarely announced. They often happen privately, internally, in the stillness where conviction speaks softly but firmly. Heaven notices these moments even when no one else does. Unexpected obedience also reveals maturity. It shows that a person has moved beyond dependence on signs and confirmations. They have learned to act on alignment rather than emotion. They do not need constant reassurance because they have learned discernment. This maturity is not loud or boastful. It is steady. It is patient. It is willing to move forward even when affirmation is absent. There is joy because unexpected obedience resists entitlement. It does not say, "I will obey because I deserve a result." It says, "I will obey because it is who I am." This posture removes pressure from outcomes. It allows obedience to be an expression rather than a strategy. It is not a means to an end. It is an end in itself. That purity brings joy. Unexpected obedience also interrupts patterns. It breaks cycles of delay, fear, and compromise. When someone obeys in a moment where history suggested they would hesitate, a new pattern is established. The future is no longer bound to the past. A new narrative begins. This shift is subtle but powerful. It changes not only circumstances but identity. There is also joy because unexpected obedience demonstrates alignment of will. It shows that desire and direction have merged. There is no internal struggle, no resistance, no bargaining. The response is immediate because the heart is ready. This readiness is cultivated over time, through small choices, through consistent listening, through humility. When a moment arrives that requires action, the response flows naturally. Unexpected obedience often carries personal cost. It may lead to misunderstanding. It may result in loss. It may require sacrifice. Yet it is precisely this cost that gives obedience its weight. When something is given freely but costs deeply, its value increases. Heaven recognizes the weight of such choices. Joy arises not from the cost itself, but from the love that makes the cost acceptable. There is joy because unexpected obedience reflects intimacy. It suggests familiarity, not distance. It indicates that the relationship is strong enough to sustain obedience without explanation. It shows that trust has been built through experience. This intimacy cannot be faked. It is formed through time, through consistency, through presence. When obedience flows from intimacy, it carries a fragrance of authenticity. Unexpected obedience also carries influence. It speaks without words. It teaches without instruction. It challenges others to examine their own hesitation. When people witness obedience that defies logic yet carries peace, it creates curiosity. It raises questions. It invites reflection. Influence born from obedience is quiet but enduring. Heaven's joy is not rooted in control, but in relationship. Unexpected obedience confirms that the relationship is alive, responsive, and genuine. It shows that trust is not theoretical but active. It reveals that love is not conditional but expressed through choice. That is why such moments matter. They may seem small on the surface, but they carry eternal weight in the unseen. unexpected obedience resonates. It sends a signal that fear did not win, that comfort did not dominate, that self-interest did not prevail. It marks a moment where trust took precedence. That moment becomes a testimony, not necessarily to others, but within the story of a life shaped by alignment rather than resistance. And that quiet act of obedience continues to echo, creating joy, movement, and transformation long after the moment has passed, and its full impact is still unfolding. The moment impossibility is challenged is the moment a boundary is crossed, not in circumstances, but in the mind and heart of a person. Impossibility survives only as long as it is accepted. It draws its strength not from facts alone, but from agreement. The instant someone dares to question it, impossibility begins to lose its authority. This moment is often quiet and internal. There is no announcement, no dramatic shift in the environment. Externally, everything may look the same, but internally, a decision has been made that what appears final will no longer be treated as absolute. Impossibility thrives on repetition. It grows stronger every time a person says, "This cannot change," "This will never work," or "This is just the way it is." Over time, these statements stop sounding like opinions and begin to feel like truths. They shape expectations, limit imagination, and quietly redefine identity. When impossibility is challenged, it is not just a situation that is questioned, but a narrative that has been allowed to dominate for too long. The challenge to impossibility does not always come from confidence. Often, it emerges from wariness. A person reaches a point where accepting limitation becomes more exhausting than confronting it. In that moment, something shifts. The question changes from, "Can this be done?" to, "Why must this remain as it is?" That question alone is powerful. It does not yet require answers. It simply creates space for alternatives to exist. When impossibility is challenged, fear reacts immediately. Fear is invested in keeping limits intact because limits feel predictable. Even negative certainty can feel safer than uncertain possibility. Challenging impossibility threatens that false sense of security. It introduces risk, and risk demands courage. But courage does not mean the absence of fear. It means refusing to let fear make the final decision. This moment often feels lonely. When impossibility has been widely accepted, challenging it can isolate a person. Others may respond with skepticism, caution, or even concern. They may interpret the challenge as denial or arrogance. But the one who challenges impossibility is not denying difficulty. They are denying finality. They are not claiming certainty of success. They are claiming the right to try. Challenging impossibility does not instantly change outcomes, but it immediately changes posture. A person who accepts impossibility positions themselves defensively. A person who challenges it positions themselves forward. Even before results appear, the internal stance has shifted. The body language of the soul changes. Hope, which had been dormant, begins to stir. Impossibility often disguises itself as wisdom. It borrows the language of experience, statistics, and past failures. It says, "We've seen this before. We know how this ends," or "People like us don't succeed in this area." Challenging impossibility requires discernment, the ability to separate genuine wisdom from learned resignation. Wisdom acknowledges risk. Resignation refuses possibility. The moment impossibility is challenged is also the moment imagination is restored. Imagination is not fantasy, it is the ability to envision alternatives. When impossibility is accepted, imagination shrinks. Options disappear. When impossibility is challenged, imagination reopens. New questions emerge. New approaches are considered. Creativity begins to function again. This moment is rarely dramatic. It may look like a quiet decision to try one more time, to speak one more truth, to take one more step. It may be a private refusal to give up internally, even if externally nothing has changed yet. These small acts of resistance matter. They are the seeds from which larger shifts grow. Challenging impossibility also redefines failure. When impossibility dominates, failure feels final and personal. It becomes proof that limits are justified. When impossibility is challenged, failure becomes information rather than identity. It becomes part of a process rather than an endpoint. This reframing frees a person to act without being paralyzed by the fear of getting it wrong. There is also humility in challenging impossibility. It is not a declaration of self-sufficiency. It is an admission that current understanding may be incomplete. It leaves room for outcomes that logic alone cannot predict. This humility does not weaken resolve. It strengthens it by removing the burden of needing to control every variable. The moment impossibility is challenged, time itself feels different. The future is no longer a repetition of the past. It becomes open again. Even if progress is slow, the direction has changed. Movement replaces stagnation. Hope replaces resignation. The internal atmosphere shifts from endurance to expectation. Challenging impossibility does not guarantee immediate success, but it guarantees transformation. A person who has challenged impossibility cannot return easily to passive acceptance. Once a limit has been questioned, it never regains the same authority. Even if the first attempt fails, the mind has been trained to resist absolute conclusions. This moment often becomes a defining line in a person's story. There is a before, marked by acceptance and retreat, and an after, marked by engagement and courage. Others may not notice the exact moment it happened, but its effects ripple outward. Decisions change. Conversations change. Energy changes. Impossibility depends on silence. It remains unchallenged when no one speaks against it, internally or externally. The moment it is named and confronted, its power weakens. Even saying, "This may be difficult, but it is not impossible," creates a crack in its foundation. Through that crack, light enters. Ultimately, the moment impossibility is challenged is not about winning a battle instantly. It is about reclaiming agency. It is about refusing to let circumstances dictate the limits of belief. It is the decision to live as someone who responds rather than resigns, who engages rather than withdraws, who believes that what appears immovable may simply be unchallenged, and that once challenged, it may begin to shift in ways that were never anticipated and continue unfolding long after the first act of courage has already taken place. Faith that shocks darkness is not loud, aggressive, or theatrical. It is steady, luminous, and deeply rooted. Darkness is accustomed to fear, hesitation, and retreat. It thrives where people expect defeat and prepare for loss. What shocks darkness is not human strength, but unyielding trust. When faith stands where fear was expected, it disrupts patterns that darkness relies on. It introduces an element that cannot be predicted or controlled because it does not originate from circumstance, but from conviction. Darkness assumes that pressure will produce surrender. It counts on fatigue, disappointment, and delay to wear down resolve. It expects people to lower their expectations after repeated resistance, to compromise after prolonged struggle, to retreat after unanswered effort. Faith that shocks darkness refuses to follow this script. It does not deny pressure. It simply refuses to let pressure define the outcome. This refusal alone is destabilizing because it removes the leverage darkness depends on. Such faith is not reactive. It does not wait for darkness to act before responding. It exists independently of opposition. Darkness does not know how to engage with calm certainty. It cannot intimidate what is not afraid. This kind of faith does not depend on immediate victory. It is not shaken by delays or setbacks. Darkness assumes that faith is conditional, that it will weaken if results do not appear quickly. When faith remains intact, despite lack of visible progress, darkness is surprised. Its strategies lose effectiveness because they are built on the expectation of discouragement. Faith that shocks darkness also disrupts internal battles. Darkness does not only operate externally, it works within the mind through doubt, self-criticism, and hopeless narratives. When faith holds its ground internally, refusing to agree with these narratives, it blocks darkness at its source. A mind anchored in faith becomes hostile territory for fear. Thoughts of defeat find no place to settle. There is a particular shock when faith appears in environments saturated with despair. Darkness becomes comfortable where hope has long been absent. It settles into routines of resignation. When someone chooses faith in such an environment, it stands out sharply. It exposes the false permanence of darkness. It reveals that what seemed dominant was actually unchallenged. Faith that shocks darkness does not argue with it. It does not engage in endless internal debates. It does not negotiate. It simply stands. That stillness is powerful. Darkness relies on reaction. When it meets faith that does not react but remains anchored, its influence weakens. The lack of engagement becomes resistance. This faith also carries endurance. Darkness often waits, assuming time will erode resolve. When faith remains consistent over time, continuing to trust, continue to act, continue to believe, it contradicts expectations. Endurance communicates that faith is not a momentary emotion, but a sustained posture. That longevity is unsettling because it signals that faith will not fade on its own. Faith that shocks darkness often looks ordinary on the surface. It shows up as consistency when inconsistency would be easier. It looks like integrity when compromise would be more convenient. It looks like hope when cynicism would be understandable. These ordinary expressions carry extraordinary power because they are difficult to undermine. There is also shock when faith produces joy in difficult conditions. Darkness expects heaviness. It expects bitterness. When faith produces joy that is not dependent on outcomes, it undermines the emotional climate darkness seeks to maintain. Joy becomes an act of defiance. It signals that inner life is not controlled by external conditions. Faith that shocks darkness is not blind. It sees the difficulty clearly. What shocks darkness is not ignorance, but courage. Faith acknowledges the challenge without surrendering to it. This balance is powerful because it prevents both denial and despair. Darkness cannot accuse faith of being unrealistic, nor can it intimidate it into retreat. This kind of faith often inspires others. Darkness thrives in isolation. It weakens when faith is observed, shared, and multiplied. One person's faith can create permission for others to believe again. That ripple effect magnifies the shock. Darkness may tolerate isolated resistance, but it is threatened by contagious hope. Faith that shocks darkness also carries authority because it is aligned. It does not fight for control, it rests in trust. That alignment produces confidence without arrogance. Darkness expects resistance to be driven by ego or desperation. When faith is driven by alignment, it cannot be provoked into excess or discouraged into silence. There is shock when faith speaks truth calmly in environments dominated by lies. Darkness depends on distortion. When faith insists on truth without hostility, it exposes falsehood without creating chaos. That clarity is disruptive. Lies lose power when truth is spoken steadily and consistently. Faith that shocks darkness is not obsessed with darkness. It is focused on light. Darkness expects to be the center of attention. When faith refuses to fixate on opposition and instead focuses on purpose, darkness is deprived of significance. This redirection weakens its influence. Ultimately, faith that shocks darkness is faith that refuses to agree with limitation. It does not accept despair as normal or defeat as final. It challenges the atmosphere simply by existing differently. It brings light not by force but by presence. Darkness is not overcome by argument, but by exposure. And faith exposes darkness by standing unafraid, unyielding, and unwavering, continuing to believe, continue to act, and continue to hope in a way that disrupts expectations, shifts atmospheres, and alters outcomes long before any visible change appears. Small obedience often appears insignificant to the human eye, yet it carries a weight far greater than its size. It is easy to assume that only dramatic actions matter, that only bold sacrifices or visible achievements draw attention. But small obedience operates on a different scale. It is quiet, subtle, almost invisible, and precisely because of that, it reveals something profound about the heart. When a person obeys in small things, especially when no one is watching and no applause is expected, it demonstrates sincerity rather than performance. Small obedience is choosing integrity when compromise would be easier. It is speaking truth gently when silence would protect comfort. It is continuing to act with kindness when bitterness would feel justified. These moments rarely feel heroic. They feel ordinary, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes even unnecessary. Yet they are powerful because they are voluntary. They are not forced by pressure or driven by reward. They arise from alignment rather than obligation. There is a unique joy that responds to small obedience because it reflects trust without spectacle. Large acts can sometimes be motivated by recognition, urgency, or crisis. Small obedience happens in the rhythm of daily life. It shows consistency. It shows faithfulness. It shows that obedience is not reserved for emergencies, but practiced as a way of being. This consistency carries delight because it reveals a heart that is steady rather than reactive. Small obedience often feels risky precisely because it seems too small to matter. The mind asks, will this really change anything? That question reveals how accustomed people are to measuring impact by scale. Yet small obedience is not about immediate visible impact. It is about alignment. It is about choosing the right response, even when the outcome seems negligible. That choice creates resonance beyond what can be measured. Great joy emerges because small obedience resists pride. It does not seek attention. It does not announce itself. It is content to be hidden. This humility is rare and valuable. It shows that obedience is not a means to self-elevation, but an expression of trust. When someone obeys without needing recognition, it reveals purity of intention, and that purity carries immense weight. Small obedience also builds capacity. It trains the heart to respond quickly and sincerely. Just as muscles are strengthened through repeated small movements, trust is strengthened through repeated small acts of obedience. Each small yes prepares the heart for larger decisions. Each quiet act of faithfulness expands inner readiness. Joy arises because growth is happening, even if it is not immediately visible. There is also delight because small obedience disrupts the assumption that significance requires scale. It reveals that greatness is not always loud. It shows that impact is not always immediate. This challenges the tendency to overlook everyday faithfulness. When small obedience is valued, the ordinary becomes sacred. Daily life becomes meaningful Routine moments become opportunities rather than obstacles. Small obedience often carries personal cost disproportionate to its size, may cost comfort, pride, convenience, or time. These costs may seem minor, but they are deeply personal. Giving up the right to be offended, choosing patience instead of reaction, offering forgiveness instead of withdrawal, are small acts that require inner strength. The cost makes the obedience meaningful. Joy responds to the willingness to pay that cost without demanding acknowledgement. There is joy because small obedience demonstrates attentiveness. It shows that a person is listening not only for major instructions, but for subtle direction. This attentiveness reflects closeness. It suggests relationship rather than distance. When someone responds to gentle prompting, it indicates sensitivity. That sensitivity is precious because it cannot be forced or faked. Small obedience also creates cumulative impact. One act may seem insignificant, but repeated over time, small acts shape character, influence environments, and alter trajectories. Habits are formed through small choices. Culture is shaped through repeated behaviors. Trust is built through consistent faithfulness. Joy arises because small obedience sets long-term transformation in motion. There is delight because small obedience often goes against impulse. It requires restraint, patience, and self-control. These qualities do not draw attention, but they carry power. Choosing not to respond harshly, choosing to wait, choosing to serve quietly are acts that reshape internal posture. They demonstrate mastery over self rather than circumstances. Small obedience also reveals freedom. It shows that a person is not driven solely by emotion, reaction, or external pressure. They are free to choose alignment even when emotions pull in another direction. That freedom is powerful. It indicates maturity. Joy responds to that maturity because it reflects growth beyond self-centeredness. There is also joy because small obedience multiplies trust. When trust is proven in small things, confidence grows. The relationship deepens. Responsiveness increases. This dynamic creates a cycle of trust and obedience that strengthens over time. It is not built through dramatic moments, but through steady consistency. Small obedience often appears unimpressive to observers, but it shapes unseen realities. It alters internal narratives. It reinforces identity. It trains the heart to value alignment over applause. That internal shaping is more significant than external recognition because it lasts. There is laughter because small obedience often surprises expectations. It defies the assumption that people will choose convenience over faithfulness. When someone chooses the right thing in a small moment, where compromise would have gone unnoticed, it reveals character. That revelation brings delight because it reflects authenticity. Small obedience also carries joy because it removes pressure. It allows people to focus on faithfulness rather than outcomes. It frees them from the burden of needing to produce dramatic results. They are simply asked to respond sincerely in the moment. That simplicity is liberating. In the end, small obedience matters because it reflects a heart that is willing, attentive, and aligned. It may not change the world instantly, but it changes the person who practices it. Over time, those changes accumulate, shaping destiny through consistency rather than spectacle, building significance quietly, and releasing joy that responds not to size, but to sincerity, not to volume, but to willingness, not to display, but to the quiet beauty of a heart that chooses to obey even when the moment seems too small to matter. Trusting beyond logic and fear is one of the most difficult and transformative postures a person can adopt because it asks the heart to lead where the mind cannot fully follow. Logic is useful, necessary, and protective, but it is limited to what can be measured, predicted, and explained. Fear, closely tied to logic, arises when logic reaches its limits and begins to imagine loss, failure, or harm. Trust beyond logic and fear does not reject reason, it simply refuses to let reason and fear have the final authority. Logic evaluates based on past data. It asks what has worked before, what has failed before, and what patterns suggest about the future. Fear amplifies this process by focusing on worst-case outcomes. Together, they create a powerful internal voice that sounds responsible, cautious, and wise. Yet there are moments when this voice becomes restrictive rather than protective. It begins to guard comfort instead of calling. It begins to defend safety instead of purpose. Trust beyond logic recognizes this shift and chooses alignment over self-preservation. This kind of trust does not emerge suddenly. It is built gradually through repeated encounters where logic was insufficient and fear proved unreliable. Over time, a person learns that not everything meaningful can be explained in advance. They learn that some of the most important decisions in life come without guarantees. Trust grows not because uncertainty disappears, but because the heart becomes familiar with choosing forward movement despite uncertainty. Trust beyond logic often feels like standing between two voices. One voice says, "This does not make sense." The other says, "This is right." The tension between these voices is uncomfortable. It exposes vulnerability. It forces a decision that cannot be justified fully to others or even to oneself. Choosing trust in that moment is not an act of impulse. It is an act of surrender. It is the willingness to be led rather than to lead. Fear resists surrender because surrender removes the illusion of control. Fear wants predictability, even if that predictability is negative. It prefers a known struggle over an unknown possibility. Trust challenges this preference. It suggests that control is not the source of security and that holding on too tightly can prevent growth. Letting go, though frightening, can create space for outcomes that control would never allow. Trust beyond logic often requires silence. It cannot always be defended with arguments or explanations. Trying to rationalize it too much can dilute it. This silence is not confusion, it is clarity that does not need validation. It is the quiet confidence that comes from alignment rather than proof. This confidence does not shout, it rests. There is also humility in trusting beyond logic. It acknowledges that understanding is incomplete. It admits that perspective is limited. This humility is freeing because it removes the pressure to have everything figured out. It allows a person to move forward without carrying the burden of certainty. It replaces the demand for answers with the willingness to respond. Trust beyond fear does not mean fear disappears. Fear often remains present, voicing concerns, raising questions, and highlighting risks. Trust does not silence fear, it simply refuses to obey it. This distinction is important. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Trust empowers courage by anchoring action in conviction rather than emotion. This trust reshapes decision-making. Instead of asking only, "Is this safe?" the question becomes, "Is this aligned?" Instead of asking, "What could go wrong?" the focus shifts to, "What is being asked of me in this moment?" This does not guarantee ease, but it ensures integrity. Decisions rooted in alignment may be costly, but they are rarely regretted at the deepest level. Trusting beyond logic also transforms how outcomes are perceived. Success is no longer the sole measure of a good decision. Faithfulness becomes equally important. Even when results are unclear or delayed, there is peace in knowing that the decision was made from alignment rather than fear. This peace is not dependent on circumstances. It is rooted in obedience. There is growth that only occurs when logic is exceeded. Skills develop through practice, but character develops through trust. When a person repeatedly chooses trust beyond logic, resilience forms. They become less reactive, less anxious, less controlled by external conditions. Their inner stability increases because it is no longer anchored to predictability. Trust beyond logic also deepens inner freedom. Fear narrows options. It limits imagination. It pushes a person toward what feels safest rather than what is most meaningful. Trust expands options. It allows creativity. It invites exploration. This freedom does not guarantee comfort, but it creates vitality. Life becomes responsive rather than defensive. There is also transformation in identity. A person who trusts beyond logic begins to see themselves differently. They are no longer defined by caution or avoidance. They begin to identify as someone who responds with courage. This identity shift affects future decisions. Trust becomes less extraordinary and more natural. Trust beyond logic often influences others without intention. When people witness calm confidence in uncertain situations, it challenges their assumptions. It raises questions. It invites reflection. Influence born from trust is subtle but lasting because it is rooted in example rather than persuasion. This trust also changes how setbacks are experienced. When decisions are made beyond logic, setbacks do not immediately feel like mistakes. They are understood as part of a larger process. This perspective reduces bitterness and increases perseverance. A person can continue forward without being crushed by disappointment. Trust beyond logic is not reckless optimism. It is thoughtful surrender. It weighs the cost but refuses to be ruled by it. It acknowledges risk but does not worship safety. It chooses purpose over protection. This choice is demanding, but it is also life-giving. Ultimately, trusting beyond logic and fear is choosing to live from a deeper center. It is allowing conviction to guide where certainty cannot. It is stepping forward with open hands rather than clenched fists. It is accepting that some paths are revealed only after movement begins, and that clarity often follows obedience rather than preceding it, shaping a life marked not by the absence of uncertainty, but by the presence of courage, peace, and alignment that continues to grow with every step taken beyond what logic alone would ever allow. When opposition underestimates faith, it reveals a critical misunderstanding about where true strength comes from. Opposition often measures power by visible resources, influence, numbers, and past outcomes. It evaluates based on what can be quantified and controlled. Faith, however, does not draw its power from these sources. It operates from conviction, alignment, and trust that cannot be easily observed or predicted. Because of this, opposition frequently miscalculates, assuming that what appears small, quiet, or unsupported is weak, when in reality it is anchored to something far deeper. Opposition expects resistance to follow familiar patterns. It anticipates fear when pressure increases, retreat when resistance intensifies, and compromise when endurance is tested. These expectations are built on experience because many people do respond this way. Faith that remains steady disrupts these assumptions. When faith does not collapse under pressure, opposition is caught unprepared. Its strategies lose effectiveness because they were designed for a reaction that never comes. Underestimation happens because faith does not announce itself with force. It does not always look confident on the surface. It may appear calm, even passive. This calmness is often mistaken for weakness. Yet it is precisely this calm that reveals inner certainty. Faith that is settled does not need to prove itself. It does not rush to defend its position. It stands without agitation, and this composure is deeply unsettling to opposition that relies on intimidation. Opposition often assumes that prolonged delay will erode faith. Time is used as a weapon, with the expectation that hope will fade and resolve will weaken. When faith persists over time without visible reward, opposition becomes confused. Persistence without reinforcement contradicts its logic. It reveals that faith is not sustained by circumstances, but by conviction. This endurance exposes the shallow assumptions behind opposition's confidence. There is also underestimation because faith does not depend on immediate success. Opposition often interprets setbacks as signs of defeat. Faith interprets them as part of a larger process. This difference in interpretation creates resilience. When opposition expects discouragement and finds determination instead, its narrative collapses. It no longer controls the emotional climate, and without emotional control, its influence diminishes. Opposition underestimates faith because it misunderstands motivation. It assumes faith is driven by outcomes, recognition, or reward. When faith continues, even when outcomes are uncertain and recognition is absent, opposition realizes too late that its leverage is gone. There is nothing to threaten when faith is not transactional. It cannot be bribed by success or silenced by failure. Faith is often underestimated because it grows quietly. While opposition focuses on immediate dominance, faith builds depth. It strengthens roots rather than expanding surface area. This hidden growth is easily overlooked. By the time opposition realizes the depth of faith, it is already too late to uproot it. What looked fragile has become immovable. Underestimation also occurs because faith does not conform to predictable behavior. Opposition relies on patterns. It studies trends and anticipates responses. Faith that listens internally rather than reacting externally breaks these patterns. It moves in unexpected ways. It waits when pressure demands haste and advances, when retreat seems logical. This unpredictability is not chaos, it is alignment. But to opposition, it appears irrational, making it difficult to counter. Opposition often underestimates faith because it measures strength individually. It sees a single person, a single voice, a single decision. Faith operates relationally. It draws strength from alignment rather than isolation. What appears solitary is often supported internally by a deep sense of calling. This internal support is invisible, leading opposition to misjudge capacity.